Hey guys, welcome to Bible Lesson 29. Hope that you are doing well today. Start off in a word of prayer. Bow your heads, close your eyes. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the many blessings that you give to each and every one of us. I pray, Lord, that you continue to bless my students as they are going through their virtual classes, that you would help them as they do their assignments to understand what they are doing, Lord, and if there are things that they do not understand, give them the courage to be able to reach out and ask and not just try to get through it, not understanding what they need to do. We love you so much, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so do you get the fruit, meaning the character of being a Christian, as soon as you are saved? No, it takes a while for that fruit to grow, just as on trees. Now I want you to say your English verse. Okay, did you say it? If not, pause the video to keep saying it. It is Philippians 1:6. Being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it unto the day of Jesus Christ. Now I want you to say it in Spanish. Okay. Filipenses 1:6. Estando persuadido de esto, que el que comenzó en vosotros la buena obra, la perfeccionará hasta el día de Jesucristo. Okay. Homework for today is to, of course, complete your weekly summary that you need to do. Make sure that it is at least 10 sentences, talking about all the important themas that you've learned this week. Then, Saeed, you're up. You need to present the doctrine, who made you, and send that to me by the end of the day, please. And I'm going to go over your verses now. I'm not saying that you have to say your verse today. I just want to remind you that you need to be saying your verses so that you don't have them all coming up. So I'm going to go through each person and tell you the verses that I have recorded. Okay? So for Albert, I do not have any verses recorded for you. Diego, I have every verse up until this week's verse, but that's because we're still in this week. But you are up to date, you're good to go. Hessen, I have week 6 verses that you have said, and week 1. So you have said week 1 and week 6, but I need all of your other weeks. Layla, I have no verses from you, Layla. So you so far need to say all of your verses. Mercy, I have week 1, week 2, and that's it. Week 1 and week 2. So you need to say the rest of those, but I do have you down for week 1 and week 2. For Michelle, I don't have any verses recorded for you either. So as soon as you can, you need to start saying your verses. Oliver, I have week 1, week 2, week 5, and week 6. So I don't see week 3. Remember, week 4 didn't have a new set of verses. It was just week 3. So that's the one that you're missing, Oliver, but you have the other ones. You have week 1, week 2, week 5, and week 6. So we need week 3 from you, please. Ruby, I have week 1 and week 2, but that's it. Okay, so Ruby, I have week 1 and week 2, but starting with week 3 onward, I don't have your verses. Saeed, I have week 1, and that's it. So Saeed, I just have week 1. Okay, that's everybody. So make sure that you are getting me your verses as soon as you can. I'm sorry if you hear a lot of papers rustling. I'm going through the checklist that I have where I record your homework. By the way, quick little insertion here. Make sure that you're still sending me your homework corrections. I have about half of you that send me your homework and half of you that don't. I'm not really saying anything anymore. I'm just not able to check off that you send me corrections, which will bring your grade down at the end of the quarter if you don't send them in. Okay. Let's get going. Acts 14, Paul and Barnabas finished the first missionary So they started out in Antioch of Syria. That's down there in the bottom right. And then they went to the island of Cyprus, and then they went back to the mainland. So they were in Antioch in Pisidia. Pisidia is kind of its own region, but we refer to Antioch as Antioch in Pisidia so that you have an idea of where they were, that you know it was this particular Antioch and not the Antioch of Syria. Then they went from there to Iconium, and from Iconium they're going to go on to two more cities, Lystra and Derbe, a little later on. Let's see what happens when they were in Iconium. And it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake, that a great multitude both of the Jews and also of the Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles, and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. Long time therefore abode they, speaking boldly in the Lord, which gave testimony unto the word of his grace, and granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, and part held with the Jews, and part with the apostles. And when there was an assault made, both of the Gentiles and also of the Jews with their rulers, to use them despitefully and to stone them, they were aware of it, and fled unto Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth round about, and there they preached the gospel. So we see at Iconium, Paul and Barnabas spoke to a group of Jews and Greeks, and many in both groups believed. And when it says here Greeks, it's talking about Greeks de verdad, not the the Greek-speaking Jews. It means, actual Greeks, because Iconium was kind of a melting pot. There were a lot of different people there from a lot of different cultures. So there were many that believed, and they began worshiping God. So once again, we see religious jealousy come into play. The unbelieving Jews, they got the other Gentiles to turn against Paul and Barnabas. They wanted to keep people from following after them, because think about it. When people started converting to Christianity, this is different than what the Jews believed. And so the style of worship is different. So they wouldn't go to the synagogues anymore. They would begin attending church services. Now, they didn't have churches like we have today, but they would attend, services together, worship together. They didn't need to go to the synagogues anymore. And so that made the religious leaders angry. So the Jews who did not believe and were still, part of the synagogue and all of that, they got the other Gentiles to become angry and to turn against Paul and Barnabas. When Paul and Barnabas, by the way, they stayed there for a while, even though, the people there were somewhat hostile towards them now. They continued to train those who did believe and to keep preaching the gospel to get more people to believe and to understand. But eventually they heard of a plot to assault them and stone them. So they fled to Lystra and Derbe to preach there. So the whole city, it was kind of divided for the time that they stayed there. It was a significant amount of time, several months maybe, that they were there. And so part were with Paul and Barnabas, part of them were against them. And so it finally came to a head when they were, possibly going to kill them, so they had to leave. There's a time to stand your ground. Paul and Barnabas, they stayed there for a good long while. It doesn't say exactly how long, but for a while they stayed there. But then there's also a time when you need to leave, when you need to flee. Pick your battles wisely. Ask God to give you wisdom. What is it my time to do? Is it my time to stand my ground, to defend my faith, or do I need to get out of here? And God will give you the wisdom as to which one you need to do. So we see them going from Iconium to Lystra, and from Lystra on to Derbe. Lystra was a very small place. It didn't even have its own synagogue that we can tell. So they would have spent a little time there, and then they would have gone on to Derbe. We're going to focus right now on while they were in Lystra. So verses 8 through 12. They say, "And there sat a certain man at Lystra, impotent in his feet, being a cripple from his mother's womb, who never had walked." That idea of impotent in his feet means his feet don't work. "The same heard Paul speak, who steadfastly beholding him, and perceiving that he had faith to be healed, said, with a loud voice, Stand upright on thy feet. And he leaped and walked. And when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, "The gods are come down to us in the likeness of men." And they called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. So what do we see here? This is interesting. At Lystra, Paul and Barnabas encountered a man who had been lame from birth. He was unable to walk since he was born. He heard Paul speak, and that gave him the faith that he could be healed. He believed in what Paul was saying. So Paul saw him, and he told him, "Stand up, walk." When the people saw this, they saw this miracle happen, they assumed that Paul and Barnabas were gods, calling Paul Mercurius and Barnabas Jupiter. So these are the Roman names for these gods. In Greek, Mercurius is known as Hermes, and Jupiter is known as Zeus. Perhaps those are a little bit more familiar to you. Hermes was the messenger of the gods in the Greek mythology, and so they called Paul Mercurius or Hermes because he was the major speaker of the group, just like the messenger. So the people were kind of basing this incident off of an old myth. Myths, remember, are not real, but they were basing it off, to them it was real, off of an old myth that these gods came down to earth in the form of two men. And while they were there, nobody really paid any attention to them. People didn't treat them nicely, not knowing that they were gods, except for one old couple. They took care of them. And so these gods, when they revealed that they were gods, they flooded the entire city, drowning everyone except for this older couple that took care of them. So perhaps the people knew about this myth, and they were nervous that everything in the myth was going to happen again, or something along those lines. Is probably an idea of where they were going with this belief. But these were not Christians. These were not Jews even. These were Gentiles, people who had not been raised to know and understand God. So they had a fear of false gods, and they assumed that Paul and Barnabas were these false gods. Let's read verses 13 through 18. Then the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates, and would have done sacrifices with the people. And which when the apostles, Barnabas and Saul, heard of, they rent their clothes, meaning they tore their clothes, and ran in among the people, crying out and saying, Sirs, why do ye these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that ye should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good, and gave us rain from heaven, and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, scarce restrained they the people, that they had not done sacrifice unto them. So we see here that they wanted to make sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas, perhaps even human sacrifices. But when Paul and Barnabas found out, they tore their clothes, they rent their clothes, and ran over to stop it. The idea of tearing your clothes, that was an extreme form of expressing horror at blasphemy, at being disrespectful to God, claiming that someone's God who is not. And so Paul and Barnabas, they understood the dangers of allowing people to believe that they were in fact gods themselves. They were very humble in that way. They respected God and God's authority. They wanted God to get all the credit. They weren't going to they did not want any of the credit for being God. It would be very easy for them to get all this attention and be loved by the people for being these great gods, but no, they knew the truth, and they were not going to let people assume that they had power that they did not. They told them that they were just men like the rest of them, that we have the same passions and desires as you guys, and that they had come to give them the gospel. They said that God had left witness of himself in the world. Hear what they say his witnesses, that he did good, that he gave us rain from heaven, that he gave us fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. So notice that their approach to witnessing is different than it was earlier. When they were talking to the Jews, Paul appealed to their history as Jews, how God had brought them out of Egypt. God was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Moses, the laws God had given, those things. But it's different here with the Gentiles. They change their approach a little bit. Same message, same God, but the way they speak to them, the perspective that they give them is a little bit different. Because here they point out God as the creator. Because that's really that's what people seek for. Who made all of this? Who's in charge? Who has power? So they're pointing out God as the creator, the one who has the power, who has the authority. He's left witnesses of himself in the world. We can see evidences of him in nature and things like that. They say that his creative power, his goodwill towards us. Even man's own conscience is a witness of God, because man knows who God is and wants to follow after him. So with a little bit of difficulty, they finally convinced them not to make sacrifices to them. Now in verses 19 through 20 it says, "And there came thither Jews from Antioch and Iconium, who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. Howbeit the disciples stood round about him. He rose up and came, as the disciples, stood round about him, he rose up and came into the city. And the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe." So we see here that the Jews who had caused trouble in Antioch and Iconium came to do the same thing here, those Jews who had turned the Gentiles against them. So they stoned Paul, then presuming that he's dead, thinking he's dead, assuming without checking, they left him outside the city. And the disciples, they gathered around him, probably thinking, what are we going to do? Let's bury him. Where can we bury him? Probably thinking he was dead as well. And he stood up and went back into the city. What? He was still alive. That's crazy, right? That was a miracle. The Bible doesn't say whether or not he stood up and was like totally fine, or whether he stood up but he was hurt. It doesn't say. But he was well enough to be able to go into the city and then leave the very next day for Derbe and continue his ministry. That was a miracle after being stoned. Paul goes through a lot, and there's a lot of miraculous things that happen with him. He's a pretty cool guy, so I'm excited to study him. Well, let's finish up their first missionary journey with verses 21 through 28. "And when they had preached the gospel to that city and had taught many, they returned again to Lystra and to Iconium and Antioch, confirming the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in the faith, that we must through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God. And when they had ordained them elders in every church, and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. And after they had passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. And when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down into Italia, and thence sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they had fulfilled. And when they were come and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all that God had done with them, and how he had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. And there they abode long time with the disciples." So we see after preaching in Derbe that they had renewed strength. They had encouragement there because they didn't receive the same opposition that they had in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. So after that, they had the spiritual strength to go back through Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. So they were in Derbe. Then from there, they went back to Lystra. Then from there to Iconium. Then back to Antioch. And so that's where they stopped for a little while. We see they were going back through there to encourage the believers in those churches, because they were going to receive, and probably were already receiving, the same persecution that they had received, those believers there. So they wanted to encourage them to keep believing, to continue in their faith in God, and to just keep moving forward, to keep growing. They wanted to encourage them to set up their churches in the correct way and to work together as believers. Next, they went through Pisidia. That's kind of the area where Antioch is. They went through Pisidia and then into Pamphylia to Perga and Attalia. So Pamphylia, that's that brown region that Perga and Attalia are part of. You can probably see the name Pamphylia there. It's an arc above Perga. So that's the region. So they went to Perga, they went to Attalia. No, it's not a misspelling that you see on the screen. There are different spellings based on the different books that you are looking at. In the Bible, Perga is written with the Y. In modern day maps, it's written with an E. So that's why you see the differences there. There would have been a slight difference in spelling, but no, I didn't misspell it this time. So then after spending some time there, they sailed back to Antioch. And they spent about a year of rest with the people in Antioch. Antioch is where they had started out, remember? And so they explained to them everything that had happened during the missionary journey and everything that God had brought to pass. And they were able to get some rest while they were there. And that's an important thing to note, is that they took some time to rest. It doesn't mean that they totally stopped ministering, but they did take some time out in order to rest and to be refreshed. And that's an important thing that everyone needs to do. If you don't rest and get refreshed, then you will be unable to continue the ministry that God has given to you. Okay, that is it for today. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next lesson, or you'll hear me in the next lesson, depending on whatever your next lesson is. Have a wonderful day. Bye.